And now to the main point of our evening, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sean Gabb again for a 6:20 evening, and it will be your pleasure in a couple of minutes. Sean is a good friend. He is a brilliant scholar, a very inventive novelist. I have a copy of his book, his last novel here, and a sequel is forthcoming. And he is also a dedicated freedom fighter in the war of ideas. He is constantly firing out scathing press releases to the media in the name of the Libertarian Alliance, of which he has been a director for longer than I can remember. And whenever researchers and journalists are looking for someone to defend the cause of freedom, which they don't do often enough, and to denounce stupid wars, they are routinely called Dr. Sean Gabb. He's been a regular feature of many radio programs and television programs, actually. Unlike many libertarians, Sean is not conceiving some future utopia that we would call a free society. He is looking at the past. He is often looking at a period almost in living memory, 100 years ago, when people in this country could spend all their lives without ever having anything to do with a government bureaucrat, except maybe coming across a bobby on the street, which we don't see many of these today, and getting their mail, because oddly enough, mail delivery was a nationalized industry. Minimal tax, no bureaucracy, no military conscription. If it were not for the stupid obscenity laws that so excited the Victorians, 1900 England would have been pretty much libertarian. I think that is what you are trying to tell us. But the roots of the philosophy of liberty run much deeper in the past. Sean, who is well versed in Latin and in Greek, has sought these roots where few liberal scholars had been looking, in Epicurus. Sean sent me the text of his talk, and it will be available to all of you, but I have not read it. I wanted the pleasure of hearing it here first with you all. Sean?
Oh, thank you very much. After that introduction, what can I possibly say to live up to your expectations? However, I've come here this evening to talk about the Greek philosopher Epicurus. Now, Epicurus was born in the year 340 BC. He died in the year 271. And he believed, and many people accepted, that he had found the way for people to lead the good life. During the next 798 years after his death, his school existed continually and often had a decisive influence over the ancient mind. And although Epicurus and Epicureanism went into a long eclipse from about the 4th century onwards, his ideas were rediscovered in the 17th century. And they coincided with the growth of scientific rationalism and utilitarianism and the doctrines that we generally know as classical liberalism. And there is some reason to believe that those facts were connected. Indeed, there is even reason to believe that the world in which we now live is as much a creation of Epicurean ideas as it is of any other set of ideas. So, that being said, let's look in some detail at the man and his ideas. As I said, Epicurus was born in the year 341 BC. He was born at Samos, which is an island off the coast of what is now Turkey. His father was a schoolmaster. He got his education in and around Samos. At the age of 18, because he was an Athenian citizen, he had to go back to Athens to perform his military service of 2 years. But other than those 2 years spent on compulsory military service, he avoided public affairs as much as possible and spent the whole of his life teaching and writing. He taught for a while at Lampsacus, which is a city near to what later became Constantinople. In the year 306 BC, he returned to Athens, where he started a school called the Garden. That is the school that existed for 798 years after his death. And he died in the year 270 of an infected kidney stone. He was 71 at the time. He never married and had no children. Now, if you want to discuss the ideas of Epicurus in any detail, there is a problem. And the problem is that virtually all of his writings have perished. Now this is a shame, because he was, by all accounts, the most prolific of all the great philosophers of ancient Greece. He wrote 300 books, or rather he wrote enough to fill 300 papyrus rolls, which would be about 30 rather stout modern volumes. His main work on nature filled 37 papyrus rolls, which must make it about the same length as Das Kapital. But it's all gone. Epicurus was a very prolific writer. He wasn't just the author of enormous books like on nature. He wrote summaries of his books. He wrote short comments, short sayings for people to carry around with them. He did run a missionary school. He was not interested just in addressing himself to a wealthy and educated audience. He believed that his ideas were available for everybody, regardless of their age, their sex, their free or unfree status, or indeed their nationality. He believed that his ideas were there for the whole of mankind, and he and his followers did their best to reach out to the masses. But, as I said, everything has perished. Of all those 300 books that Epicurus wrote, we have only 3 short letters of his, plus a collection of his short sayings. We have these because they are collected in the only surviving biography of him. Of the library of Epicurean literature that grew up during his life and after his death, again, virtually all of it has disappeared. We have quotations and accounts in the works of Cicero, of Seneca, of Plutarch. There are a mass of brief quotations and references in the works of grammarians, historians of philosophy, and other Greek and Roman writers. And that would be almost it. Except that we do have the De Rerum Natura of Lucretius, which is an epic poem in 6 books, which tries to outline the physical theories of Epicurus. Indeed, Lucretius is the only long connected source we have of Epicurus's physical ideas. And so it is very difficult to talk in detail about what Epicurus taught. We do need to look at often hostile accounts. We do need to look at accounts by people who may not have understood what they were talking about, who may have been misquoting, and who often, we are quite sure, were misrepresenting him. This does present difficulties. If you want to talk about Plato or Aristotle, we have very good sources. We have virtually everything that Plato wrote, and virtually all of Aristotle's lecture notes, though his more polished works also have disappeared. But for Epicurus, we are relying unusually on secondary sources, and this can lead us astray. If you take the works of extant philosophers, could you get a good overview of what Karl Marx said simply by looking at the Marxist and anti-Marxist scholars of the 20th century. But by all accounts, 19th century writers consistently misunderstood David Hume's epistemology. We can discuss that because, of course, all the works of David Hume have survived. But where Epicurus is concerned, we are not sure. Now, we have a reasonable certainty of Epicurus' ethics, a reasonable certainty of his physics, but we do not really know much at all about his philosophy of mind or his epistemology. What we do for the most part is to proceed from what we know Epicurus and his followers did say to what they might have said on other issues. Now this is not as bad as it might appear, because Epicurus was a remarkably consistent philosopher, and we can, with reasonable confidence, proceed on the basis of the few scraps of Epicurean literature which have existed towards a reconstruction of the whole system. But it can only be conjectural, and if you ask me difficult questions about what Epicurus said, in many cases I shall just say, I don't know. I don't know because I am not a good enough scholar, but in many cases I do not know because the basis on which good scholarship would exist is simply lacking. So, with that very big reservation made, what did Epicurus say? Well, let us begin at the beginning with his ethics. And Epicurus, like all the other Greek philosophers of that age, was primarily interested in ethics and in the good life. So, for Epicurus, what was the good life? And the answer is happiness, or the pursuit of happiness. Epicurus believed that the good life consisted not in the pursuit of justice, or wisdom, or honour, though those things were important, but above all else, in the pursuit of happiness. And Epicurus says on the subject of happiness that he says, "Pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and every aversion, and to it we come back inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which to judge of every good thing." Now, I should say that when Epicurus is talking about happiness or pleasure, he's not talking about the pleasures of drunkenness, of lust, and of gluttony. Although the words epicure or Epicurean have been associated with somebody who enjoys the good life, Epicurus had a rather more elevated view of happiness. He says, and we have his own words on this, "When we say that pleasure is the end and aim, we do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal or the pleasures of sensuality, as we are understood to do by some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. By pleasure we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. It is not by an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and of revelry, nor by sexual lust, nor by the enjoyment of fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table, which produce a pleasant life. It is sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, and banishing those through which the greater tumults take possession of the soul. Of this the beginning and the greatest good is wisdom. Therefore wisdom is a more precious thing than even philosophy. From it springs all the other virtues, for it teaches that we cannot live pleasantly without living wisely, honourably and justly, nor live wisely, honourably and justly without living pleasantly." And so that is what Epicurus meant by happiness. He did not mean the pleasures of the moment. He certainly did not mean the solitary or selfish pleasures of the moment, because for Epicurus one of the highest pleasures was in friendship. And he spent his entire life seeking out friends, and maintaining friendships. He encouraged his followers to preserve their friendships above all else. So happiness consists in sobriety, in the avoidance of those pleasures which lead to pain, and in seeking the greatest pleasure which comes from peace of mind, or the absence of mental and spiritual pains. And as I said, the highest of these pleasures lies in friendship. Now, this is a very brief overview of his ethical teaching, and hedonism has always had a rather controversial reception. Now, there are problems with hedonism, as we well know, and we do not know to what extent Epicurus was any more successful than Jeremy Bentham or in the Benthamites of the 19th century in solving the problems of a purely hedonistic ethics, because, as I say yet again, the main primary sources are missing. We just don't know what he said about these. However, there is nothing particularly scandalous in saying that the pursuit of happiness is a good thing and that friendship is part of that pursuit. And yet Epicurus, during his own lifetime, for the 800 years following his death, and ever since the revival of learning, has had a thoroughly bad reception among most philosophers and most intellectuals. Even in his own day, there were the most scandalous and unlikely defamations written of him. We're told, for example, that Epicurus vomited twice a day from overindulgence, that he composed pornographic literature, that his brother was a pimp, that he stole most of his ideas from Democritus, that in his book on nature he simply repeats himself again and again and again, that he consorted with prostitutes, that his garden was a place of endless gluttony and lust and drunkenness, and that Epicurus encouraged all of his followers simply to engage in the pleasures of lust and gluttony and drunkenness. Now we know from his surviving works and the accounts of his followers which have survived, and indeed I've quoted some of them, that was not part of his intention. And so why is it that Epicurus, even in his own lifetime and afterwards when his works were readily available, was so persistently and often so hysterically denounced on the grounds of immorality? One answer, I suppose, is that his philosophical opponents were transferring to his ethics a condemnation that they could not easily make out, or that they did not wish to make out, of his other doctrines. Do you remember about 20 years ago, Margaret Thatcher made an unwise slip in an interview with a women's magazine, where she said that, well, you know, there is no such thing as society. Now she, what she meant was that too many people make a thing of society, whereas all that does exist is individuals and families and small communities. And that's all to say that society must do this, society is to blame, society should not do that, is rather silly. However, those words, "there is no society," were immediately taken up and have been used against her and against conservatives in general ever since, by people who were and are in a position to know that that is not what she intended. Now, that is because there are many people who disliked Margaret Thatcher's economic policies but couldn't think of reasonable arguments against them, so they simply seized on the first unwise statement they could find and attached it to her. And it may be that it's the same with Epicurus. It may be that his opponents looked at his ethics and said, we'll go for those, because we can't get him very easily on the other stuff. And so what is it about the ideas of Epicurus that made him so controversial among ancient philosophers and ancient intellectuals. And the answer, or one answer I think, is that for Epicurus, part of the pursuit of happiness is freeing ourselves from fear of the gods and fear of death. Now, one of the main problems of social policy throughout history, up until about 1950, and perhaps since then, has been how to reconcile the poor to a social order in which they are at a considerable disadvantage. In all societies before our own, there have been a very small number of very rich people who've enjoyed plenty of food, warm clothing, nice houses, good health care, clean water, good education, who have enjoyed the good things of life in the physical sense. And they have been faced by an overwhelming majority of people who did not have those things. How is it that you get the poor to accept this order in which they are at a persistent and obvious disadvantage? Force is part of the answer. It is possible for the rich to hire armed force to keep the poor in line, but of course you may not be able to hire enough mercenaries, you may not be able to trust the mercenaries to do their job, and even if you are able to afford a great deal of force, it may not be sufficient in all times and all places to protect the lives and property of the rich. And so, in every society before our own, and perhaps in our own, the rich have always relied on religious terrors. In Egypt, the pharaoh was a god, or the pharaoh was regarded as a god, and the system of which he was the head was regarded as a reflection of the divine will. You did not touch the Lord's anointed. You did not touch the living God who was the Pharaoh, and you kept your hands off the property of those who were around the Pharaoh. In the other empires of the ancient Near East, the king might not have been a god, but certainly he was the chief embodiment of a system that again reflected the will of the gods. If you can persuade the poor with sufficient success that God wants the order that is, you may persuade them to keep their hands off your life and your property. Now, the ancient Greeks did not have the sort of religion or the sort of theology that lent itself very easily to this kind of endorsement of the order that was. Greek religion was very largely a decentralized collection of rather scandalous stories about gods who looked like human beings and behaved like human beings. They were better looking than human beings, they lived longer, they were much stronger, but they had all the same faults as we had, and the gods of the Greeks had not created the universe, and they were not all powerful. They were not, for example, watching people at all times. As long as you stayed on the land, you could say what you liked about Poseidon. Apollo had no power over the sea. In many cases, the gods were only supposed to have any power while you were in their temple. And you could always try to play off one god against another. The right kind of sacrifice or religious bribe would buy off this particular god, and he would then protect you against another. And so the Greek ruling classes did not have the same automatic recourse to religious terrors as the Egyptians, the Babylonians, or especially the Jews had. That was a problem for the Greeks. Another problem was that from about the 6th, 7th centuries onwards, they'd been going through an enlightenment. The Greeks developed mathematics and philosophy and the beginnings of modern science. They began to realize that the world was a reasonably stable, harmonious place governed by law. And we know that during a time of enlightenment, people eventually stopped looking at the fossil record, they stopped looking at the movement of the heavenly bodies, and they start thinking about the particular shape of the social order in which they live. And this had been happening in Greece for about 100 years before Epicurus was born. About 100 years before Epicurus was born, the Greeks did not have a serious problem with class warfare. Most people were small farmers. Any excess population could be decanted into the colonies of the Western Mediterranean, and the number of slaves does not seem to have been unmanageably large. But then there was a growth of commerce, and there were a series of very disruptive wars between Athens and Sparta, and this led to or coincided with a growth of class differences. You saw the beginnings of a small class of the very rich facing a large class of the very poor. And this led to class war within the Greek city-states. It led to massacres, proscriptions, revolutions, civil wars, mass exiles, general disorder. And one of the questions that Plato addressed was what to do about this. And Plato's answer, and I accept that Plato is an enormously sophisticated and often ambiguous philosopher. He wrote at least 2 different books on the ideal social order, and one shouldn't mix these together. But very crudely summarized, Plato's solution to the problem of Greek city-state class war was to stop the Enlightenment and to reconstruct society as a totalitarian oligarchy in which people would all be told their place. There are these people who are at the top, there are these people who are in the middle, and there are these people who are at the bottom. And education, strong military force, and religion would stabilize this society and prevent the great social disorders that the Greek city-states had been through in the 5th and 4th centuries. Now, the religious terrors that Plato was thinking about were not the terrors of the original Greek theology. As I said, there was very little in the way of an organized Greek theology before Plato. And Plato reconstructed Greek religion. Plato said that there is one God who created the world and who is all-powerful within it. And this one God operates through various demigods and secondary spirits who may be associated with the traditional gods of the Greeks, but this one God has divinely ordained the society that Plato wants. And any disobedience within that society will be treated as a kind of heresy. Now, Plato never got the society that he wanted, but his books, The Republic and the Laws, were very influential, and it was a general belief among philosophers and intellectuals in the ancient world that they had all the answers and that governments should listen to them. And it was against this that Epicurus directed a large part of his efforts during his life. Epicurus said let's discuss Epicurus's physics. Now, what Epicurus says is that the whole universe consists of two parts. There is an infinite void, a vacuum, which has always existed, always will exist, and which extends in all directions forever and ever. This void is infinite in age and in size. Within this void, there is an infinite number of atoms, or very small, indivisible particles of matter. These atoms are all moving at incredibly high speeds. As these atoms move through the void, they knock into each other. The atoms are hooked in various ways, and sometimes the atoms will bounce off each other when they collide, and sometimes they will hook together. And by a process of repeated collisions, these atoms will accumulate into objects which can be perceived by the human senses. And that explains the entire universe. There is nothing but atoms and motion. You can explain heat by the vibration of atoms, because when atoms come together in larger structures, they do not lose their motion, which is inherent to themselves. The atoms vibrate. Instead of moving forward, they will vibrate. And the more they vibrate, the hotter they will seem. We can perceive physical objects because all of these objects continuously cast off very thin films of atoms which strike on our eyes and our ears, and these very thin films of atoms are exact representations of the objects from which they emanate. These objects are also absorbing atoms, so that just by looking at something will not necessarily wear it out. And so that is it. There is no supernatural intervention in the world. If you want to know why there has been an eclipse of the moon, it is because the moon, which is a piece of rock in the sky, has moved into the right position. It's passed in front of the sun. If you want to know why there are thunderstorms, if you want to know the reason for lightning and thunder, it is something to do with the upper atmosphere, and the reason why we see the lightning first before the thunder is because, for some reason, light seems to travel faster than sound. And Epicurus said, you can see this because if you see two people fighting with swords at a distance, you will see the movements. You'll see the clashing of the swords slightly before you hear it. And so it seems to be that light travels faster than sound. And so it's quite reasonable to assume that over much greater distances, you'll see the flash of lightning first, and then you'll hear the thunder. Everything in the world can be explained in terms of natural forces. There is nothing but atoms moving in a void. The atoms move predictably. Or rather, the atoms do not move absolutely predictably. You see, if you imagine atoms moving through the void like drops of rain, they'll travel in straight lines, they will never collide with each other, and they'll never be able to form together into larger objects which can be eventually perceived by the senses. There is another possibility, which is that the atoms are not all moving in the same direction. They're moving in different directions, and they collide. But if the atoms are always moving in a straight direction, then their collisions can at all times be, in theory at least, predicted, and that means that we live in an absolutely deterministic universe. And this conflicts with the observed fact of free will. And so Epicurus claims that the atoms move generally in straight lines, but every so often they're capable of a very small random swerve from the straight, which he believes will explain the fact of human free will. Now, there are problems with the physics of Epicurus. One of them is the universe purely an accident? If you imagine that the universe has always existed and that it's infinitely large, then you can imagine that there will be random collisions of atoms which will produce something that looks like an orderly universe. And the continued random movements of those atoms will give the appearance from moment to moment of a universe that is governed by law. At any moment, the universe may simply disaggregate into the original atoms. They may come together for a few seconds, give the appearance of orderliness, and then drift apart again. Or this may continue for long periods. But that being so, it's very difficult to say that everything in the world happens because of natural forces. Relationships of cause and effect only make sense on the assumption that the future will be like the past. And if the movements of those atoms are absolutely random, then it's difficult to find room for causality. If, however, there are natural laws that govern the movements of those atoms and that holds the universe together, then you may have another problem. This is not a problem that really affects us, because we are used, ever since Newton, we're used to talking about observed regularities and not looking for first causes. But the Greeks had a much greater interest than we have in first causes. If you assume that there are certain natural laws which govern the movement of atoms, then there is an obvious question of was there an author for these natural laws, or what is their source? Now, we just do not have enough of Epicurus's writings to answer those questions, and there is nothing in the secondary sources that seems to suggest an answer. We do know enough about Epicurus's epistemology to know that he was an empiricist. He says, in our study of nature, we must not conform to empty assumptions and arbitrary laws, but follow the prompting of the facts. It's the facts that are important. Despite these problems, you will probably admit that the physics of Epicurus are an astonishing achievement. He did, as far as we can tell, get it right. He didn't talk, as other Greek philosophers did, about the world as a product of earth, air, fire and water. No, he had a fully blown atomic hypothesis, and it does explain how the universe works. There are many problems, but by and large he got it right, and Epicurus would not have been greatly surprised by modern physics, and he probably wouldn't have been that surprised by the theories of Darwin and the Darwinists. But we mustn't get carried away with Epicurus's physics, because although for us the purpose of knowledge is to give control over the world, we learn about the world so that we can control the world and make the world a better place for us. For Epicurus, this was not a particularly important matter. Indeed, he doesn't appear to have conceived this. He says, if we had never been troubled by celestial and atmospheric phenomena, nor by fears about death, nor by our ignorance of the limits of pain and desires, we should have had no need of natural science. Remember that, like everything else, knowledge of celestial phenomena, whether taken along with other things or in isolation, has no other end in view than peace of mind and firm convictions. The whole physics of Epicurus are a way of producing peace of mind. And the peace of mind that comes from his physics is the knowledge that you are also made of atoms, and you will also die. And when you die, the atoms that comprise your body and soul will drift apart and be reallocated within the universe, and that is the end of you. After death there is nothing, and death itself is nothing. You shouldn't fear death, because when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. There are no interventions by the gods in human affairs or in the universe. There are no punishments and rewards after death. And so do not fear the priests. Do not fear the stories about the gods that you hear. Just get on with your life in this world and be content with that. Try to make yourself as happy as you can in this life, and don't worry when people tell you, oh, if you do that you'll go to hell and burn forever and ever, because it isn't true. There is nothing in the universe apart from atoms, and when the atoms that comprise you have drifted apart, that is the end of you. Your atoms are immortal, but you, the the larger structure of those atoms, is a temporary construct. And so you might ask, how do you control people? How is it that you can create and maintain a stable social order without religious terrors? And Epicurus' answer is a social contract. He says that natural justice is a pledge of reciprocal benefit to prevent one man from harming or being harmed by another. And he also says there never was such a thing as absolute justice, but only agreements made in mutual dealings among men in whatever places at various times, providing against the infliction or suffering of harm. And so Epicurus appears to be arguing for a world in which we should pursue our own happiness, in which we should not be frightened of the gods, and in which we should respect the life, liberty and property of other people and expect them to do likewise. And given those things, the good life can be led by the largest number of people. Now this does sound remarkably like classical liberalism as it emerged in the 17th century. And although, as I keep on saying, those 300 books he wrote have all perished, and although we're often looking at hostile commentaries by other people, that does appear to be what Epicurus was arguing. Now, at the end of the ancient world, from about the 4th century onwards, Epicurus's ideas went into eclipse. These were ages of depression and of disaster. And it may well be that the ideas of someone like Epicurus are not very attractive to generations of people whose lives are uncertain and whose lives are often unpleasant. And that might well explain the growth of Christianity, because Christianity does tell you life is a vale of tears, but afterwards there is a happier place. There is nothing necessarily sinister about the disappearance of virtually all the Epicurean writings. Papyrus books only lasted for about a century, and then they fell apart. They had to be recopied. There never were that many books in the first place, and so if an author were not copied and recopied and recopied, the chain of transmission could easily be broken, and that would be the end of that particular author. In ages where there were fewer libraries, and the libraries that existed did not have the same resources, librarians had to choose which books should be recopied and which books should be allowed to perish, and it is quite reasonable to assume that without any active malevolence, librarians simply allowed the works of Epicurus to perish. They were not taken out and burned, they were simply left on the shelf until they fell to pieces, and then they were thrown away with the other rubbish. However, let's fast forward to the 17th century, and how long do I have, Christian? 10 minutes?
Yeah, something like that. Yes.
Okay, let's fast forward to the 17th century. One of the main facts of English and French social life in the 17th century is the declining belief in the miraculous and the supernatural in general. And one of those striking examples of this decline is the total collapse of belief in witchcraft. In 1600, virtually every educated man in Europe believed unquestioningly in witchcraft. By 1700, the educated classes had nothing but contempt for stories of witches, and they gradually communicated their own contempt further and further down the social scale until belief in witchcraft simply disappeared. It evaporated. Now, there were witch hunts in the early 17th century. Tens of thousands of people across Europe, and thousands of people in France, and hundreds of people in England were executed for witchcraft. And the judges had no doubt that these people were in communication with the devil. However, in the second half of the 17th century, there were fewer and fewer witchcraft trials. Until 1712, when we had our last ever witchcraft trial in England, the trial judge laughed at the prosecution witnesses, summed up against the prosecution. When the jury found the defendant guilty against his direction, he suspended sentence, procured a royal pardon, and a pension for the accused witch. And after that, there were no more trials for witchcraft. Now, what caused this sudden collapse of belief in witchcraft? And the answer is not that there had been a long pamphlet controversy. If you look through the pamphlet literature in English and French of the 17th century, you'll find nothing about witchcraft that you find about religious toleration. There was a debate over religious toleration in which both sides were fairly evenly matched. There is very little about witchcraft. There are many people arguing with great ability that witches did exist, but there is almost nothing on the other side arguing that witches did not exist. This was a belief that died without attack. And what probably the reason for this is that belief in witchcraft died along with a general system of belief. Now, we may regard people who believe in witches as bigots and fools and, generally speaking, as irrational people. But belief in witches is perfectly rational, granted certain assumptions. If you believe that the world is filled with invisible and very powerful spirits, that some of these spirits are good and some are evil, that certain persons are able to communicate with these bad spirits and are able to strike some deal with these bad spirits to give them power over the world, once you grant those assumptions, witchcraft becomes a perfectly reasonable explanation for eclipses of the sun, hailstorms, floods, and epidemic diseases. And seeking out and punishing the authors of these ills is a legitimate purpose of the law. If, on the other hand, you believe that the world operates according to fixed and knowable natural laws, you don't need to think about witchcraft. It is an hypothesis for which there is no need. Why bother blaming the failure of a harvest on some mad old woman when you know that it's something to do with the weather or something to do with an infection of the crops, when you know that there is a natural explanation? Now why was there this sudden change of worldview in the 17th century? One reason is the revival of the ideas of Epicurus during the early and middle years of the 17th century. The works themselves had perished, but a number of French philosophers and a number of French philosophers gathered up all that they could find, every reference that they could find to Epicurus, put it into various systematic treatises, published these in Latin and in French, and sat back and waited. And during the later 17th century, you had the scientific revolution, you had Boyle, you had, of course, Newton, you had Locke, and all of these philosophers believed in the atomic hypothesis. Newton's physics are very similar to those of Epicurus. The main difference between Newton and Epicurus is that Newton believed that the atoms were not infinitely old but had been created by God. He also believed that the atoms did not have an inherent motion. The motion was given to them by God. He also believed in action at a distance, or in gravity, that there were certain regularities of motion, so that the atoms would move in predictable ways without necessarily colliding. And so it is possible to argue that the scientific revolution of the 17th century was built on Epicurean foundations. It is also possible to argue that the social contract theorists like Locke and the utilitarians of the 18th century, people like Helvetius, Beccaria, David Hume, and later on Jeremy Bentham, were also greatly influenced by Epicurus. It is possible, and I'm making a rather bold statement here, it is possible to say that the entire modern world, based on scientific rationalism and some degree of liberalism, is a product of the revival of Epicurean ideas in the 17th century. And so it seems to be rather ironic. We have almost every word that Plato ever wrote, and almost nothing that Epicurus wrote. Yet if you look at the social impact of Plato over the past few centuries, what you mostly have is legitimation for various cliques of demented and quite often murderous intellectuals. Of the few insignificant scraps of what Epicurus wrote, we may well have everything that is worthwhile in the modern world. Now this is a brutal summary of a long text that I wrote earlier in the week, and this will be available on the Libertarian Alliance website in the next week or so, but I'll be happy to take any questions. And thank you for your indulgence. I know I've spoken for rather longer than most people do, but before I give the floor back to Christian, allow me to mention my novel, The Column of Phocas, which is an historical novel filled with sex and violence set in early medieval Rome. It's so impressed the commissioning editors at Hodder and Stoughton that they bought it on the spot and have commissioned a further 2 novels from me. I still have a few copies of the first edition.
But this is mine, it's not going away.
Oh, no. Don't worry, I have a bag full of them. And I'll sell them tonight at the special discounted price of £5 a copy. There is also this book, Cultural Revolution, Culture War, which I published just a few weeks ago. It has already had a very encouraging reception. It's been reviewed by the most unlikely people, and somebody of some considerable importance telephoned me before I went away on holiday to order 12 copies to hand out to his friends. The normal price of this book is £9.99. I will do that tonight for £5 as well, so £10 for the pair of them. And I've now said enough, and it's back to Christian. Thank you very much.
Thank Thank you very much, Sean. That was brilliant. Before we take any questions, Sean has been recording his talk, and so if anyone is uncomfortable with the recording of questions and answers, we'll put an end to that. So now is the time to...
You're not being filmed, it's focused on me.
Yeah. Okay, so if no one objects to the names and questions being recorded, I will take questions. Richard.
Thank you. I wonder if it's a bit rash to credit Epicurus with sort of all of the things around now. I actually didn't mean absolutely well. There's one thing in particular that strikes me as very much missing from his ethic as we have it, which of course may not be the whole picture, and which was there before him. So what I'm thinking of is, it's great to get to a position in which you needn't have any worries. Yeah, you needn't have any fears, certainly not any irrational fears, this sort of ataraxic state, that's fine. But having got to that, it strikes me that shouldn't be all there is to life. Where's the ambition? Where's the drive to achieve? Which to some extent you can see in Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia. You're supposed to fulfill your potential. And if we were all good Epicureans, we wouldn't devise all these fabulous, wonderful scientific theories at great cost to the people who devise them. It's a lot of hard work, because we don't need all of what we've got just to remove our fears about the gods and that sort of thing. We've done a whole lot more than we need in these very Epicurean terms. Creation of works of art, the sort of agony and ecstasy picture of Michelangelo. You wouldn't put yourself through all of that. You wouldn't have passionate love affairs, which can be tremendously worthwhile, even though on balance they don't do a lot for your happiness. Well, yeah, considered over your whole life, you may well feel that the balance is negative, but my goodness, they're still worth it. And yeah, do you have any views on that? That maybe Epicurus is missing something which correspondingly the more vulgar modern utilitarians, people like Richard Layard, the Science of Happiness people, are also missing.
That could well be, though. I haven't read that much of the ethics of Epicurus because there isn't that much to be read.
Sure.
So we're not quite sure what he did say in any particular detail. It does seem to be that modern utilitarianism and the modern world in general has gone considerably beyond Epicurus, particularly with regard to the sciences. The main difference between us and Epicurus is that for him science had a negative value. It freed us from fear of death and the gods, whereas for us science and knowledge in general have a positive value in the sense that we can, by understanding the world, we can control it, and by controlling the world we can make ourselves happier. So I'm not saying that the modern world is purely a projection of Epicurean ideas, but we are to a significant degree standing on his shoulders. Yes, as Newton said of Boyle, I am standing on the shoulders of giants.
Well, yes, giants were before us, but because we are standing on their shoulders, we can see farther.
Yes.
That's right. George.
Fascinating talk, absolutely superb. I wasn't aware that we owed so much to Epicurus. I've got 3 very brief points, 2 questions and a point. The questions. Question 1, where does the idea of liberty appear in Epicurus? Question 2, is there any indication that the sages of the 17th century were indebted to Epicurus? Do they refer in their writings to Epicurus? Locke, for example, or Newton, or any of these? These are the 2 questions. The observation. Newton did not believe in action at a distance. He was puzzled. That was his conclusion. You see, any scientific theory must do 2 things: to predict and to explain. Newton's theory managed to predict magnificently. He couldn't explain, and he was acutely aware of it. And he wrote somewhere that I don't make hypotheses.
Yes.
And the explanation appeared only 300 years later with Einstein.
Answers. With regard to Newton, as I said, we have grown used to the idea of not worrying about final causes. We're quite happy to look for regularities and not to ask why. We don't know why gravity exists. We don't really know what gravity is. All we know is that by assuming certain relationships, we can predict the movement of particles of matter. With regard to Epicurus and liberty, no, Epicurus does not, in any of his extant writings, talk about liberty. Though he does talk about not harming others and not accepting harm from others.